Well, hey there, everybody. Bill Sherck, the man about the woods. Welcome to the Minnesota Bound podcast, the stories behind the stories. And if you're like me with the holiday weekend, you're packing up, you're headed to the beach or the cabin or getting ready to do a backyard celebration with the family. And, I started thinking about the 4th of July and the flags and red, white, and blue. And it got me thinking about a trip that I was able to take not too long ago that really has had a pretty profound impact on my life. And that is a visit to the beaches of Normandy. We'll get to that in a second. But first off, a big thanks to our newest sponsor of the Minnesota Bound podcast, North Dakota Tourism. Okay, let's get into this piece. So, going back in time, when I graduated from college, from old St. Norbert back in 1994, just a couple of days after graduation, I found myself on an airplane headed for Europe to spend part of the summer with a backpack on traveling. And I had found myself on the beaches of Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Pretty profound stuff for a young guy. Sitting on those sand beaches over the English Channel, looking at the concrete German bunkers slowly giving way to time as, the beach grass and the sand just continued to erode. And this old guy, I can remember him hobbling up the hillside with a cane. And I knew who he was because at that time, the government had given all the U.S. soldiers these placards to wear around their necks. And he hobbled up, and I just sat as he talked about that day. So, pretty profound moment in my life. Now, let's move ahead to just a couple seasons ago when my good friends at Rapala and VMC invited us to travel to France to document the story behind VMC hooks, which are made in the far eastern region of France, almost over on the Swiss border. So we spent a couple of days there. My good friend from VMC, Cyril, and I, Mathieu, were there. And then we hopped on a plane to go towards Normandy. And we stopped in this little French town of Putange. I'll probably say it wrong. I never get it right. Putange, Pointe-à-Crepin, which is on the Orne River. And we fished for trout, brown trout, alongside one of the coolest guides I've ever been around, Gael Evan. Gael. We fished, we caught trout. It was one of the literal prettiest rivers I have ever been on, tucked down in a shaded valley. All the rocks had bright green moss on top. The water was gin clear. It was just an amazing experience. But we fished in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we headed for the beaches of Normandy, which was an unbelievable experience. Again, I was there for the 50th anniversary, which was the first time the world really celebrated that anniversary and made a big deal of what happened that day. But here I was to be back on those beaches 25 years later. And it's just life-changing stuff. A little bit about the story of D-Day. Everyone always asks, oh, D-Day, yeah, I've heard about it, but I don't necessarily know quite the details. It was named Operation Overlord, and the U.S. or Allied troops kind of played their cards, right? They played a bet that they could really push back the Germans by surprising them. Tuesday, June 6th, 1942. Think about it. 156,000 Allied troops surprised the Germans on the beaches of Normandy. And the German troops, There were 50,000 of them that day trying to defend. And during our tour there, it was amazing because you look in all the museums and the places, and they have the pictures of all these German soldiers, and they look like little kids. And that is part of the history, that the Germans didn't have many resources left. So people there talk about sacrificing a generation, because here all these Allied troops were fighting these very young soldiers. It was just an amazing thing. So you've got all the beaches, right? You've got Omaha and Utah, and the bunkers. You walk into these bunkers that are still there, that the Germans fortified, and they are concrete structures. You know, the edges are eroded. Some of them literally have bomb scars and holes in them. The sand is blowing in, but you crawl into these things and just think about what the world was like at that time. And we had this really sassy tour guide. She was amazing, from Paris, and she talked about the fact that the German soldiers were locked into these bunkers. The Germans forced them to be there. And although they didn't really have much of an inkling that the U.S. troops were coming, the Allied troops, they knew something was up. So you think about very, very scary times. So we documented the beaches for Minnesota Bound. And I've always been amazed, because you'll see these tractors with boat trailers down on the beaches as the tide's coming in or going out. And I always wonder what that was about. And they are divers. They go out in boats and they dive and they pull stuff up, because that whole part of France, you know, the ocean floor there is covered with remnants of D-Day. So people are constantly going to see what's down there. All right, so a fishing story, right, for Minnesota Bound now turns into a very poignant tribute to the Allied troops. And it all really hit me up on top of the hill. And I'll tell you what's up there in a second. But first, we need to thank a few sponsors that make the Minnesota Bound podcast what it is. Again, we've got a big thanks this week to our newest sponsor, North Dakota Tourism. You know, you should start planning your fall hunt in North Dakota at legendarynd.com. Right now, North Dakota is home to more than 800,000 plots hunting acres. Those are private acres of land that are open to public hunting. And the plots guide, you can see the maps online, or else they offer a book. It shows you exactly where all that open land sits. You know, right now, North Dakota's ringneck pheasant crowing counts are up 15%. That's really good news. The state is also home to an estimated 2.9 million breeding ducks, an absolute oasis just waiting for you. We try to take a trip every year to North Dakota to hunt sharp-tailed grouse and pheasants, and guess what? We always come home with absolutely incredible memories. Bag your limit this fall in North Dakota. Visit legendarynd.com. Hey, I'd also like you to pay attention as we wish the best to the Minnesota Propane Association.
Hi, I'm Laura Sherck, and do you really know what it costs to heat water at your home, cabin, or business? No? Well, we do. Based on data from the U.S. Department of Energy, the average annual savings for homes that heat their water with propane rather than electricity is $175. You can save energy and get 2.5 times as much hot water compared to the average electric water heater. Let's save energy and money with a cleaner, greener fuel. Propane, the right energy right now.
And I've got one more for you before we get back to our story. Our good friends at Voyageurs Saunas. No doubt, the world has been a crazy place lately, right? Busy work schedule, kids, coaching, travel, pandemics, all this stuff. It just can be overwhelming. But you know what? I found an incredible way to take some time and truly get away. And I do it with a Voyager sauna. Voyager builds custom units for your home, backyard, even your business, and they are the only company building premier mobile saunas, units on wheels. They go anywhere you go. Really, it's been the pick of the Sherck family. Uh, the Craftsmen use clear grade cedar benches, spray foam insulation, Kuma wood-fired stoves, or Hilo electric heaters. These are Finnish-influenced, hand-built saunas that will last a lifetime, and they are constructed by Care with the team. Voyager, a Minnesota movement influenced by Finnish culture. Visit voyagersaunas.com and get ready to de-stress. Trust me, it works. Okay, so back to our story. Probably one of the most emotional I've been a part of in my tenure as a television guy. Our good friends at Rapala and VMC had invited us to France to see how VMC hooks are made. As part of the trip, we did a little fishing in Normandy, and then Cyril, my friend and tour guide, so to speak, for the trip from VMC, Cyril and I headed to the beaches of Normandy. And after walking the beaches and documenting the memorials, the German bunkers, just all the sights there, we walked up on top of the hill, which, of course, is where the Normandy American Cemetery sits. And it is a place that will stir you if you ever visit. Interestingly enough, that little 172 acres, France gave to the United States. So the United States cares for that. 172 acres where 9,388 Americans are buried. There's also what they call the Wall of the Missing, with the names of 1,557 soldiers that were never accounted for. You've probably seen the pictures of these white marble crosses, very green grass, meticulously cared for, which after the war was something France committed to. D-Day changed the war, and essentially the Allied troops gave France its freedom back. So the French are very, very emotional about this. So they have taken very, very good care of the U.S. cemetery there, and again have turned it over to the United States, and it's still just meticulous. But what is haunting is if you go down the road just a few kilometers, there's something called the Lacombe Cemetery, which everyone hears about the American cemetery, but this was the German cemetery. And it is a place that by design has a very, very different feel to it. Think about the numbers. The Normandy American Cemetery, 172 acres, about 9,400 soldiers buried there. You look at Lacombe, the German cemetery, 22,000 German soldiers buried there on a mere 40 acres. It is a haunting place. They were buried two at a time. The headstones are lava rock crosses. They are dark, just mysterious looking headstones. When we visited, it was morning. It was cool. There was dew. Everything was wet. And it was just unbelievable to walk through that area. And the thing that really gets me about that cemetery, the average age of the soldiers buried there, 17 years old. So just numbers like that really tell the story for me. And what is amazing about this part of France, and the reason I'm talking about it today, is most of us can't relate to what happened there, right? Those soldiers were part of the greatest generation. And you think about France and in that area, every single town has a story. Think about where you live. Think about some almost unbelievable war story about rescue and battles. And then consider the next town over had its very own story, and one after another, right? Every town has just these unbelievable story. We visited something called Dead Man's Corner, which is famous. There's a museum there now, but it is famous because during the invasion, these soldiers were working inland, and one of the radio guys was shot and killed in as I remember, it was a U.S. tank. And he was slumped over in the top of the tank, and he continued to do his job until he faded away. But his body was there for days. And the Allied troops knew of Dead Man's Corner. If they saw the tank and they saw that radio man on the top of that tank, they knew where they were going, and they knew they were in the right spot. Every town has just profound stories like that. And yes, that tank still exists in that little town there. So, all right, one more visit about, or one more set of details about our visit to the beaches of Normandy. But first, we need to get another break in. You know, the Minnesota Bound podcast doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of help from great sponsors. And one of our favorites is Connecticut. You've probably heard of Connecticut. You know, the Sherck family, we love our Connecticut water. We live out in the country, and we have that ironclad well water, which is good news and bad news, right? Well, we treat all of our water with a Connecticut whole home water treatment system. We also use Connecticut's K5 drinking water system. That white buildup you get around faucets, we've got none. Our dishes are clean. My wife, Katie, loves what Connecticut water does for her skin and her hair. And as I always say, the Sherck boys always fill their water bottles before soccer and hockey practices with Connecticut. They refuse to drink the water from the drinking fountains at the arenas. I think that's a pretty good pitch for just how good Connecticut water is. Call Connecticut like we did and look forward to clean, safe water. Hey, we'd also like to thank the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources.
Minnesota's wildlife management areas are a vast array of lands all across Minnesota. These 1,440 wildlife management areas are valued not only for wildlife, but also for Minnesota's outdoor recreation opportunities. They maintain hunter walking trails, plant food plots for wildlife, and develop acres and acres of prairie and grasslands. To find out more, go to mndnr.gov/WMAS.
Back to our tale about the beaches of Normandy. Again, for me, that place has had quite a role in my life. I studied history in college and communications, and here I am just like a month after graduation back in 1994 on the beaches as the world remembered and celebrated. Pretty amazing for a 21-year-old kid to be there witnessing all that. I remember all the old paratroopers were still able to jump out of planes, you know, some of them literally in their 90s making jumps. And just meeting all the U.S. soldiers, hearing the stories. And then I get to go back just a couple seasons ago with my friends from VMC and Rapala and revisit and document for Minnesota Bound. And it was amazing because we ended up at a restaurant, at Utah Beach. That was built, as I understand it, this building survived the invasion, but underneath it, there was a German bunker. And the bunker is fully intact, including cots down there, the radio equipment, some of the supplies. And the story is that when the U.S. took over this bunker, they realized they could get radio communications back to the United States. So the troops used that bunker to give soldiers a chance to try and communicate with folks back home. And it's pretty amazing to go down in there. The old radio equipment, the German soldiers, before Allied troops got to them, they would bide their time by drawing on the walls, and some of that is still up. Once the U.S. had it, they had pinup girls that are still hanging. It's just an amazing story about time and history. And above it is this restaurant. What was the name of it? I guess it was called Doolittle's, maybe. And in this restaurant, you walk in, and they've got some of the historic stuff, old, uniforms hanging, a few of those things, some radios on the wall. But one day, they had a soldier that was back to visit the beaches sign the wall, took a permanent marker and signed the wall. Well, as you can imagine, one thing led to another, and now this restaurant is covered in thousands upon thousands of signatures, some of them with one-sentence stories, two sentences, pictures of the soldiers. It has become an absolute memorial to the beaches of Normandy and the D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord. And it is one of those special places that just gives you energy as you understand what those people did to turn the tide of a world war. And for me, it culminated after lunch. We were outside. Our visit was essentially done. It was time to get back to Paris so we could fly home. And I was standing there, and they have these little concrete pillars by the beaches. And this pillar just said, Utah. It's, 2.5 feet tall in the sand. And I looked down at that pillar. And I chuckled a little bit, and I thought, I was just standing here. Amazing. I was just here. And it turns out it had been 25 years. Time flies. We need to appreciate the here and the now, but we also need to look back and remember. And that's part of the reason we're in business at Minnesota Bound. That is one of my favorite stories ever documented for our television shows, that trip to the beaches. And it's my way of paying homage to those that have come before us. So there you go. That's the story about the beaches of Normandy. I appreciate you listening today. Again, this is the Minnesota Bound podcast, the stories behind the stories, presented by Connecticut Water Treatment Systems. My family uses Connecticut. You should too. Also, a big welcome to our newest sponsor, North Dakota Tourism. We appreciate having you on board. Also, our good friends at Voyager Saunas and Mobile Units, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Minnesota's Propane Association, and the Minnesota Lottery. A special shout out, our July 4th podcast, the lottery sponsors Minnesotans making a difference. Watch for it with our Hopkins Cops and Kids story. Thanks again for listening, and until the next time, remember what we always say. Don't forget to introduce a kid to the great outdoors.